Spotlight is proudly sponsored by HEC Media, St. Louis's home for arts, education, and culture.
Tennessee Williams found St. Louis a necessary adversary.
The artists really tried to expand the notion of what portraiture can mean.
I would be proud to think that I added to that knowledge.
Today on Spotlight, a local study finds that cats are less stressed when adopted by families that have children with autism. Plus, it's the final stop for this exhibit organized by the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. And then women who paved the way for female journalists while trying to get the story during times of war. But first, honoring playwright Tennessee Williams behind an apartment building where he used to live. It's Sunday, and you're watching the multiple Emmy Award-winning Spotlight. On December 26, 1944, Tennessee Williams' play, The Glass Menagerie, opened for the first time at the Civic Theater in Chicago. This past summer, the Tennessee Williams Festival St. Louis performed this play at a very special location.
In this St. Louis neighborhood, something magical happened. It took place here at this Central West End apartment building. History says one of its past renters had a major impact on American literature. He was born Thomas Lanier Williams III, but later the world would know him as Tennessee Williams, the award-winning playwright and screenwriter.
I knew of the building on the corner of Westminster and Walton.
It was a childhood home of Williams. 2021 marks the 6th year of the Tennessee Williams Festival in St. Louis. One of his more famous plays was performed where the Williams family lived when they first moved to St. Louis.
Because we had produced it on the radio last year and we fell in love with the cast, I thought, let's do it there.
This outdoor production has been a momentous challenge, one that I'm glad that a very dedicated team has risen to. From the top down, it's been all hands on deck, because not only are we producing a theater during a pandemic, we're producing it outdoors when there's a heat advisory most days, and we're on blacktop, but we're doing one of the most beloved plays in American theater in front of a very historic building. And so I think there's a magical quality to it, but there's a lot of magicians backstage that a lot of people don't see.
The Glass Menagerie is a memory play that catapulted Williams from obscurity to fame. It has a strong autobiographical element. The characters mimic himself and members of his immediate family.
I wanted to almost have the actors appear as ghosts of the past. There was a look of terror in my director's eyes, Brian Holfeld. He's known me a long time and we've done many projects together. But a lot of the team just thought, we may never get this chance again to do something this magical.
The festival's mission is to enrich the cultural life of St. Louis by producing an annual theater. It's an opportunity to celebrate the achievements of Tennessee Williams and educate the public about his work.
We produce his known titles, Streetcar Named Desire, Night of the Iguana, The Glass Menagerie, but we also have unearthed some works that are just recently published. I think most people do not know how extensive his body of work was. He wrote over 200 plays, many of them one-acts, and there's a whole body of work that the public has not really been introduced to, and I thought that was really important.
This is our first time at this lot. I hope that we're able to come back because, again, it's a very historic building for Tennessee Williams Festival. This is the first time I've ever had where the actors and the director are living on the set.
It's almost surreal to think about. 3 of the 4 cast members are living there. We've lodged our scholars there, so we've almost done a building takeover. I stood in the 3rd floor apartment that is said to be the Williams family apartment, and I watched the show through the curtains down on our stage, and I just thought, I can't believe this is happening, because you could almost feel his presence all these years later.
Even in the midst of a global pandemic, the festival was still a huge success.
We have sold out capacity the whole run. We've made one very important national publication, the New York Times, which was always a dream, and we got it this time. And people have flown in from all over the country to see our jam.
And now an excerpt from the HEC exclusive documentary, Searching for Tom, Tennessee Williams in St. Louis.
Tom spent the first 7 years of his life in Clarksdale, Mississippi, with his mother Edwina and sister Rose. Tom's father, Cornelius, or C.C., came from a family prominent in Tennessee history and was a traveling salesman for a shoe company. He was rarely at home, and that was an arrangement that worked well for the entire family. All of that changed in 1918 when C.C. was promoted to sales manager, an office job at company headquarters in St. Louis. C.C. liked the big city, but for the rest of the family, it was an unfamiliar setting.
The culture of his family told him that St. Louis was not as good as Tennessee or the South. His writing in the junior high and high school were about, awful, smoky, dirty St. Louis.
They moved to a fashionable neighborhood. Westminster Place was a street of fine homes, but the Williams family didn't own one of them. They rented an apartment at the end of the block. Tom was enrolled in nearby Eugene Field School, where the small, sickly boy with a Southern accent was immediately a target of bullying.
Even as a child, his stories are about being picked on at the grade school when he was little. And I think probably, maybe more than anything else, was growing up in that very, very dysfunctional household.
His father was no longer on the road. For the first time, the entire Williams family had to live all together under the same roof.
Cornelius was not a very nice man, and beyond his personality, drank and was out of control, it seems like, a lot of the time.
They had another child, Dakin, who in time would become C.C.'s favorite, especially as Tom showed more interest in reading and writing than sports. In high school, his vivid imagination was already starting to pay off. He won $5 in a magazine essay contest on the topic, "Can a wife be a good sport?" Few would have guessed that the man writing about his unfaithful wife was actually a 16-year-old boy. And the summer before his senior year, Tom's byline appeared in another national magazine. Weird Tales paid him $35 for a story of intrigue and revenge set in ancient Egypt. Buoyed by his literary accomplishments, Tom Williams decided he would go to the University of Missouri and enter its acclaimed journalism program. The 3 years he spent at the University of Missouri were the most stable and happy he had known since leaving Clarksdale. Although he was still known as something of an oddball, he had friends, he went to parties, and he joined a fraternity. With a degree, he might have gotten a newspaper job. Plenty of writers, from Twain to Hemingway, had started out in journalism. But just a year from graduation, he was abruptly thrown off that path. Tom had flunked the required ROTC class, and whether it was that or financial issues, C.C. would not let him go back for his senior year. He got Tom a job where he worked at the International Shoe Company downtown.
Those are two very intriguing years where we don't have a whole lot of information.
After 3 years of college, of personal and creative freedom, Tom Williams was again trapped in the dysfunction of the family's Enright apartment and driving to work every morning with his father in strained silence. While the next 2 years were miserable and frustrating for Tom, they were, for the writer he would become, some of the most important years of his young life. He was getting the kind of education that no university could provide. And it was these experiences that would make deep impressions on the young writer and eventually find their way into his greatest works.
I think he's a very autobiographical writer. Those conflicts in the family, in the city, in himself, in his own body, were things that he worked out through his whole life.
The presence of these years is most strongly reflected in The Glass Menagerie, in which a young writer, Tom, spends his days working in a warehouse and his evenings going to the movies to escape his tiny apartment and oppressive family. He put so much of himself into his writings that it's easy to confuse Tom Williams with the character Tom Wingfield. But The Glass Menagerie is a fictionalized version of his life, focusing only on a mother and daughter and son. In the play, the father has abandoned the family, and the setting is a cramped city tenement, far more bleak than the Williams suburban apartment.
He did exaggerate some of the poverty, but at the same time, I'm sure he felt spiritually impoverished here.
In 1945, The Glass Menagerie opened on Broadway. The playwright, Tennessee Williams. Tom was now just a character, a young man stuck in a warehouse job in St. Louis, straining to break free of his family and follow his dreams. Until his death in 1983, there was more of St. Louis and Tennessee Williams than people realized, and more than he would have wanted to admit.
In fact, he spent much more time in St. Louis than he ever did in New Orleans, which is the city that we associate with Tennessee Williams. And I think that's significant. Tennessee Williams found St. Louis a necessary adversary.
Scan the QR code on your screen to watch the full exclusive documentary or visit hecmedia.org.
HEC Media. Recognized, celebrated, honored time and again for excellence in the industry. HEC Media has been bringing home the hardware for over a decade. Arts and education to author talks, magazine shows and documentaries, individual craft achievements to overall excellence. Find all of the award-winning content at hecmedia.org.
McLean Clevenger has found true companionship and comfort in Bash, the family cat.
Sometimes at school, on my tablet, I write all about Bash sometimes.
Bash got his name for being bashful, which makes him dash away from the camera and hide behind Garfield, the family's other cat.
Bashy.
McLean seems to understand his companion.
I get too nervous to come out.
After all, the two were meant to be. The University of Missouri found Bash for McLean through a research study.
And sometimes he likes to come outside.
The 9-year-old boy from Moberly, Missouri, has autism. The MU College of Veterinary Medicine study selected shelter cats for Missouri families like the Clevengers. Families participating in the study have at least one child with autism. The match was made to see if the children and the cats do better together.
They had these animals in the shelter, and they went in and ran some behavioral testing on them. And they picked 3, gave us a call and said, we have 3 matches that we think are going to work great with your child, with his personality and his characteristics. They were great. They were very calm. Their personalities meshed really well. And when we saw Bash, he was number 3 we got to see. And when we saw him, it was game over for us.
In fact, the match is so good, Bash has gone on trips to McLean's school, which helps McLean manage stress and anxiety.
Communication is a huge part of autism in general. He knows what he wants to say, but for it to come from the brain out the mouth is really hard. So in return, you get the anxiety, and then you get behaviors as well. We've been blessed not to have the behavioral side. We were smart enough to kind of figure that out a little bit in advance and realize it's not behavior, it's anxiety.
Researchers previously found that adding a shelter cat to the family can help lower stress and anxiety for children with autism. Bash also suffered from anxiety, and this new study shows how the match does wonders for the felines too. First, the shelter cats were screened using the feline temperament profile.
If you're looking at a child with sensory issues, a child that may have frequent temper tantrums or outbursts, this really requires an animal who will also be successful and tolerate this. We need an animal that's going to have that resilient, calm, social behavior.
Dr. Gretchen Carlisle is a research scientist at the MU Research Center for Human-Animal Interaction. After a match was made, Carlisle's research team made home visits to check on the cats. And what they found in active home environments like this is that over time, the cats became significantly less stressed. Bash has settled in.
The measures we used, the first we used was cat weight. It's well documented that cats that are under stress tend to lose weight. And the cats in our study all gained weight after adoption and maintained that better weight. The other measure that we did is cortisol. So cortisol is a stress hormone. In our study, we found no increase in the cortisol levels of the cats after adoption.
Shelter cats that are screened for a calm, easygoing temperament may increase the likelihood of a better long-term match for both the children and the cat.
It's really grown McLean's social skills. He's taught him how to have a bond with someone. So social skills and emotions, understanding your emotions, his emotions, others' emotions, is a tough challenge for individuals on the spectrum. And for McLean, he's learned to work through those emotions and have a bond with someone, because it's very hard for McLean to bond with someone. It's a beautiful match, and it's taught McLean so much. Responsibility is huge. So McLean has a responsibility. That's his cat. It's a reason for him to wake up each day. He gets to feed and water.
And McLean will even step up to offer advice for anyone not in the family who wants to hold Bash.
Yeah, sometimes you have to be careful of him, because when you hold him, sometimes he can scrape you and he just runs off.
But when Bash turned away from the camera and the company and he sees McLean, all is as it should be.
He's purring.
Scan the QR code on your screen to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
We're at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum at Washington University, and this exhibition is called The Outwin: American Portraiture Today. This show is coming to us from the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, and it is an exhibition that happens every 3 years. It's called the Outwin Bouchever Portrait Competition. The exhibition here includes the finalists of that portrait competition, including 47 different artists from 14 different states, including Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. Artists were invited from across the country to submit a portrait. There were over 2,600 applicants, and the competition includes the final 47. So there is a first place winner. Each first place winner receives $25,000, and they are also commissioned by the Portrait Gallery to create a portrait of an important American figure. And the winner of this competition is the Latinx artist Hugo Crosswaith. So the competition includes a whole range of media. So you'll see photography, you'll see painting, you'll see installation work. And the artists really tried to expand the notion of what portraiture can mean. So when you come to the exhibition, you're going to see a whole range of different themes that are important today specifically, including immigration, Black Lives Matter, and LGBTQ+ rights. Other artists are looking back historically and using photographs of an earlier time to kind of bring more representation to the present. For some artists, they describe this as an activist effort to try to bring these sort of lost histories or histories that are not often seen today back to light in our present moment. So one artist who does this is Deborah Roberts. Her work is a portrait of George Stinney Jr. He was the youngest person at the age of 14 to be put to death by the electric chair for a murder he did not commit in 1944. She shows us a portrait of this figure as both an homage to George Stinney Jr., but also as a representation of the violence and the trauma in the Jim Crow South. Another example is a work by the artist Lava Thomas. She creates a piece called Lottie Green Varner. It's a work in graphite that shows us a portrait, actually a mugshot, of a woman who was part of the Montgomery bus boycotts. And she was arrested for civil disobedience. This is part of a larger series where she's trying to bring more representation to the women associated with the civil rights movement. So taking in this exhibition as a whole, you'll see that many of these artists are really trying to understand the legacy of portraiture and how we can bring it into our contemporary moment, thinking about larger questions about representation, both whose images are shown, whose images are elevated, and who gets to speak. The Outwin will be on view at the Kemper through January 23rd. The Kemper Art Museum is free and open to the public, and you can find out more about the exhibition and our range of public programs at the museum's website.
An Erin Bode original, later on Spotlight. Bold, ambitious, brave. You may not recognize these women's faces or know their stories, but what they wrote, photographed, and broadcast revolutionized the narrative of World War II and paved the way for future female journalists.
They were there when the bombs were going off and the battles were being fought. They were willing to go anywhere where the story was, but also they were incredibly adept at cultivating sources, at knowing who to talk to.
And because of that, they regularly scoop their male counterparts, even interviewing Mussolini and Hitler.
Hugely competitive, and she would drive through air raids literally to try and get to a phone faster than anyone.
War reporting isn't easy for anyone, but as Judith Mackrell writes in her book, The Correspondents, it was made even more difficult for these women who sought out clever and often dangerous ways to get the story.
They were just finding loopholes and sneaking their way to the front.
Since prejudices and bureaucratic restrictions barred them from the press corps until 1944.
It was extraordinary.
Author Judith Mackrell introduces us to these 6 trailblazers and their harrowing experiences.
There were death threats, there were threats to incriminate her as a spy, her phone was tapped, her sources were murdered, and she kept on writing about the Nazi Party until 1941, which was amazing.
Plus, she talks about how she discovered their stories.
And I was thinking, who is this extraordinary self-possessed young woman, not only to stand up to Hemingway, but to be in that situation in the first place.
And discusses their incredible highs and lows of reporting during World War II.
It was this very kind of paradoxical thing that it was both the most exciting and fulfilling and complete experience of their lives, when all of them had the satisfaction of feeling they were caught up in something so much larger than themselves, but then also knowing that it was an experience that had changed them utterly and made it very difficult for them to live an ordinary life again.
As people read this, journalists, women, what do you hope the takeaway is? I mean, or what is the takeaway, that you experienced?
Well, I think it's been great the last few years how war historians are now acknowledging the importance of the female voice, not simply what women suffered, but also what women contributed to the fighting of wars and the reporting of wars. So I would be proud to think that I've added to that knowledge about women in war. I'd like you to correct perhaps the misconception that generation were, quite conventional, quite, not great feminists. I mean, they were hugely competitive with each other, but they believed they were as good as, if not better than men, and they went out to prove it. But I think on a wider political level, particularly as we've just passed Armistice Day and all that recognition of the millions who died fighting wars, I think all my women had a very strong perception after the Second World War was over, that although it had been an absolutely just and noble war, that in the end, nothing much had changed, and that governments still needed to be held to account, and that the struggle for a more civilized world, didn't end with the Second World War, and that do wars even bring that about? So it's odd. I guess writing about war, I would like people to take away a message of peace.
Scan the QR code on your screen with your phone's camera to watch the full interview and find out about one of the women who hid in a bathroom on a hospital ship so she could get to France to be able to report from the front lines. That story and more at hecmedia.org.
Go to hecmedia.org for the arts and authors,
Completely accidental because I never set out to write a book.
science and history, culture and community,
It's considered to be the oldest organic farm west of the Mississippi.
education, films,
Finding the coin places the site firmly in the 13th century.
what's happening now around St. Louis, and more. See for yourself at hecmedia.org.
The sun is low. It's early, I know. The
orange sky close. On and on I go. And I'm skating on, and I'm almost home. And I'm skating on, and I'm almost home. Coming cold, coming fast, the wind is bold. Can't feel my face, my feet, my hands that used to hold. But these skates on this lake will take me back to the fold. I can fly if I try, I can fly. Even on a bright and sunny day. The snow is deep, the wind is on its way, bearing every path I cleared from the other day. If I don't hurry, I'll have to go home by another way. And I'm skating on, and I'm almost home. 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 Oh, 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 oh.
Next week, a Webster student gets high praise by the United Nations. Plus, a historian writes a book that takes you on a trip through the Middle Ages. Thanks for watching Spotlight. Join us next Sunday at 9:30 a.m. on KPLR 11.